that would be awesome, so that we can acknowledge who is asking the question. There's going to be information about the book and where you can purchase it. You can purchase your copy from Maryhill, and all of that will be at the end of this segment. It'll be on the slide. And so now, again, thank you all and welcome. And please allow me to introduce the Executive Director of Maryhill Museum of Art, Colleen Schafroth.
Hey, thank you, everybody. Really, thank you for joining us today in this very difficult time we're all living in at the moment. I am grateful you are here. I am grateful to our members, our friends, and our supporters. Without you, we couldn't make it through this. Maryhill is, as you all know, a remarkable place, and I have been happy to work at the museum for a little over 30 years now, which sometimes is a disconnect, but to me, it seems like it can't have been that long. It delights and amazes, and it inspires all who visit. Just because I know some of you are wondering, I'm also adding here that hopefully the museum will be able to open its doors this year to do that, but it looks like it will be well into August. We're lucky. So keep that in mind and check our website. But it could even be September before we can open our doors. But to the point of this gathering tonight, our speaker, Steve Wiegand, author of Dancer, The Dreamers, and the Queen of Romania. Steve is an award-winning journalist and history writer. His 35-year journalism career was spent at the San Diego Union-Tribune, where he was chief political writer, the San Francisco Chronicle, where he was state capitol bureau chief, and the Sacramento Bee, where he was a special projects writer and political columnist. He has authored and co-authored and contributed to over 8 books and has been published widely. As he writes in his foreword, he took a dizzy September morning, a boring drive from Yakima toward Oregon via State Highway 97, and a cryptic paragraph in an automobile club guidebook, and you get a book about one of America's most interesting museums. At least I did, he writes. My wife, Seal, and I were headed to California after a month in British Columbia in the fall of 2015. Looking for something to break up the drive a bit, Seal came across a brief description of the Maryhill Museum of Art in an AAA guidebook. So we followed the signs. It was Monday morning and the museum was almost empty. So we talked at length to a couple of staff members about Maryhill and its history. It would make a great movie, said one of the staff, or a book, said my wife. 5 years, 6 trips to Maryhill, and time-consuming diversions that included writing 2 other books and moving to a different state. The Dancer, The Dreamers, and the Queen of Romania was a reality. It was a labor of love, he writes. So without further ado, Steve, here you are.
Thank you, Colleen. And
here's the book.
Oh, good. Yeah, show the book.
Yeah, there's the book.
Thank you, Colleen, and thanks to everybody for zooming in. And I have to say from the outset, I kind of like these Zoom things because I don't have any shoes on right now. So that makes it much more comfortable. I'm going to guarantee 2 things to you before I'm done. One is you're going to know how much I've become to love Maryhill over the last 5 years or so. And the other is that I'm really a lousy public speaker. So I hope you'll bear with me over the next, 2.5 hours or so. Just kidding, it's just gonna seem that way. As Colleen pointed out, the way we discovered Maryhill was like a lot of people probably do. We were coming down 97 on our way home to Sacramento and came across the guidebook paragraph and thought, well, what the heck, let's go look at it. And we drove into the parking lot and were just transfixed by this drop-dead, gorgeous 3-story concrete building next to this spectacular scenery. And it really, I thought the New York Times caught it perfectly in a 1987 article. The Times writer said that the museum was oddly fitting. It brought the better works of man near one of the better works of nature. So we figured we'd go in, take a look at it, and very least we'd get some photographs. And here's my first plug for the book. there's a 32-page insert in the book of both historic black and white and color photos, many of them taken by my wife, Seal, who's an accomplished photographer. As Colleen pointed out, it was a Monday and it wasn't very busy, and we got to talking to the admissions lady, and she started telling us about the most beautiful woman in the world and Rodin's best friend and the most famous dancer in the world, and you could sleep on the roof, and Sam Hill, the railroad tycoon.
We're both watching it.
We were kind of transfixed. So as we were leaving, the admissions lady said she thought it would make a great movie. And my wife said, oh, or a great book. And that kind of stuck with me. So when we got home to Sacramento, I began going through what had been done on Maryhill. And I found there had been biographies written of the four so-called founders of Maryhill: Sam Hill, Laurie Fuller, Queen Marie, and Alma Spreckels. But they naturally focused on the individuals. And I thought maybe there was a biography on the museum itself. So I poked around on the web for newspaper articles and magazine pieces that had been done. I called the Klickitat County Historical Society, and they put me in touch with a woman named Dr. Judith St. Pierre, who was a local historian and had volunteered for many years at Maryhill. And we went back up to Goldendale, Washington, and met with Judith. She gave us a number of materials, and that piqued my curiosity further. So over the next 5 years, I made 6 trips to Maryhill and spent hours going through the museum's voluminous collection of correspondence and materials. And by the way, freezing my butt off, because to preserve all these materials, it's got to be kept very cool. So I found out really quickly why Anna Goodwin, the collections manager, always had a sweater. And I should, in mentioning Anna, I should say thank you to her for her infinite patience and goodwill and putting up with my sometimes annoying personality, digging out everything I needed out of the box after box after box, and answering all my numerous email queries. I also pestered Colleen and Steve Graff, Maryhill's curator. I interviewed past and present staff members, as well as a few relatives of some of the people that had worked at Maryhill. And I explored library collections in the Dalles, Goldendale, White Salmon, Vancouver, Portland, Seattle. I visited Sam Hill's mansion in Seattle, which is a National Historic Landmark. We went up to the Peace Arch that straddles the US-Canada border near Blaine, Washington, and which, by the way, attracts about 500,000 visitors a year. And we even watched a lunar eclipse at Stonehenge with a crowd that included some people I think were from Middle Earth. They had the cows and everything else. So that was an experience in itself. I also squeezed in a time-consuming move to another state and wrote 2 books in the interim. But in 2019, March, I finally finished what had become a labor of love. And in March of this year, The Dancer, the Dreamers, and the Queen of Romania was published by Bancroft Books, which is a Baltimore-based publishing house. And I think they have extraordinary judgment in what they print. So thank you, Bruce Bortz, who's the publisher and the owner of Bancroft. I'd be remiss as an author if I didn't mention that I think it's a pretty good book. And casting all modesty aside, I think you should go out and buy at least 2 copies. If you'll indulge me now, I'd like to read 3 brief excerpts from the book. I've adapted them a bit to make a little more sense, taken out of context. The first is meant to give you a feel for the 4 characters who are usually regarded as the founders of Maryhill, although they were by no means the only ones that created the museum and kept it going. The setting is Election Day, 1926. And this was the first time all 4 were together in the same place, and the same day, the day before the museum was dedicated. The Queen spent most of Election Day in Montana. Being a queen, she had little interest in elections. Being the Queen of Romania, she had only a tourist interest in Montana. Marie Alexandra Victoria was on the 16th day of her historic tour of the United States and Canada. It was historic in the sense that very few queens had ever visited North America. In 1887, The Queen of Hawaii had traversed the United States on her way to England, and in 1919, the Queen of Belgium had toured the United States. But these queens had nothing on this queen. This queen was a war heroine, an author, a diplomat, and a well-paid spokeswoman for perfume and cold cream. She was the granddaughter of both the late Queen Victoria of Great Britain and the late Tsar Alexander of Russia. She was related to royalty in nearly every country in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was her cousin, as was King George V of England. And she was, in the vernacular of the time, the bee's knees when it came to her looks. She had celebrated her 51st birthday a few days before. That fact, and the fact that she had borne 6 children, had added a few inches to what had once been an impossible 16-inch waist. But her figure was still curvaceous, her honey blonde hair still luxuriant, and her sky blue eyes still simultaneously guileless and beguiling. Marie had an easy, genuine smile, and she exuded a heady mix of maternal warmth and schoolgirl coquettishness. And she also didn't lack self-confidence. Yes, I know I am said to be the most beautiful woman in Europe, she told an admiring interviewer in a book published the year of her tour. About that, of course, I cannot judge because I cannot know. But about the other queens I know, I am the most beautiful queen in Europe. She was also coming to America at just the right time. With the Great War behind her and awash in waves of consumerism and mass media, Americans in the 1920s were suckers for ballyhoo. Hundreds of magazines and 2,000 daily newspapers printed millions of words of news, gossip, commentary, speculation, and innuendo. They were supplemented by 20,000 more movie theaters, and 500 radio stations. And nothing stirred up public interest more than celebrities, especially ones who sported crowns. Will Rogers, America's beloved cowboy sage, observed in his newspaper column that, quote, "Them Democrats and the Republicans is trying to have a little election and striving to get a little publicity on it. But Lord, Marie landed right in the middle of it, and everybody that even remembered the names of the candidates has forgot them by now. Don't ever say Americans ain't cuckoo over titles and royalty." So you can see that Marie's tour of the United States was clearly a very big deal. She'd received a ticker tape parade in New York City, where the mayor of the city openly admired her bosom. She had dined as a guest of honor at the White House with President and Mrs. Coolidge. By the way, he was one of the few men who didn't like Queen Marie, and she thought he was a dried up old prune. On November 2nd, Queen Marie's luxurious special train crossed Montana and northern Idaho on the way to Maryhill. The next day, she was scheduled to give a keynote speech at the museum's dedication. And the train reached the Davenport Hotel in Spokane. There were 3 friends there. The first was Samuel Hill. Depending on whom you ask, 69-year-old Sam Hill was either a courageous visionary or crazier than an outhouse rat. Southern born, Northern raised, and Harvard educated, Sam wasn't the source of the popular phrase, "What the Sam Hill?" That expression had predated him by decades, but it was often used when people talked about him, and people often talked about Sam Hill. Physically, Sam tended to dominate his environs. He was tall, and his broad shoulders, large head, and thick hair made him seem even taller. In his younger years, he was considered one of the most handsome men in Minneapolis. Now, in his seniority, a woman traveling with Marie described him as, quote, "a perfect giant of a man with his shaggy white head and his ruddy, kindly face. He reminded me more of a childhood dream of Santa Claus than anyone I had ever seen, with his rosy face and shaggy white eyebrows. He looked like a hero who had stepped out of a book of legends. His great broad shoulders and kindly smile vivified and exalted with delight." A lawyer, railroad executive, utility company owner, world traveler, and transportation pioneer, Sam Hill had made and spent fortunes. He'd been decorated by the leaders of 4 nations for contributions to promoting peace and for building roads and supporting humanitarian causes. He was a master of the grand gesture. He once spent $100,000 to sponsor a round-the-world trip for a French general whom he admired. And even his occasional tantrums were outsized. He once angrily kicked his top hat back and forth across the lobby of a posh hotel for 15 minutes because his room wasn't ready. Sam had a penchant for quixotic projects. These included a peace arch that straddled the US-Canada border, a full-size replica of the ancient British monument Stonehenge on the banks of the Columbia River, and a 5,200-acre, almost entirely unpopulated agrarian community on the Washington-Oregon border, which he called Maryhill, after his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law. Somewhat conveniently, all of them were named Maryhill. Part of Sam's Maryhill dream was an immense 3-story block of concrete situated on a ledge a few hundred feet above the Columbia on his vast acreage. The locals jokingly referred to it as Sam Hill's Folly. Once he had planned it as a home for his mentally ill daughter, a gathering place for his friends, and a refuge for himself. But World War I, financial reverses, and other distractions meant the mansion had never been finished, let alone lived in. By 1926, his plan was to turn it into a center for the world's artists, an oasis of beauty, a beacon of world peace, or something like that. Now, along with Sam, there were 2 women who the Queen knew well. The first would have stood out in almost any crowd. Alma Spreckels was 6 feet tall, without heels, at a time when the average height of an American male was 5'9". At 45, her youthful voluptuousness had given way to a more matronly appeal, but her visage still boasts clear blue eyes and a creamy complexion. She was expensively, if not extravagantly, dressed. Alma had parlayed her good looks from posing nude for paintings displayed in San Francisco saloons to becoming the mistress and eventually the wife of sugar baron Adolph B. Spreckels. Spreckels was 24 years older than Alma, which made him the original sugar daddy. Big Alma, as she was widely known, had a personality as equally outsized as her physique. She spoke to be heard, often in the next room. Her favorite drink was martinis, by the pitcher. She loved to swim in the nude, sometimes with an audience. When she went shopping for furniture in France, she told reporters, "I'm going to find me a bed that kings have made love in." She was routinely profane and often witty. When the popular gossip columnist Elsa Maxwell once cattily asked her how old she was, Alma snapped back, "Old enough to remember when there was no Elsa Maxwell." She was also very, very rich. The week before Marie arrived in America, the California Inheritance Tax Office estimated with bureaucratic precision that Alma and her children were heirs to a $14,944,495 estate left by her late husband. That translates to more than $200 million in today's currency, making Alma one of the wealthiest women in the country at the time. Her San Francisco mansion was the most palatial in the city, her silver Rolls-Royce limousine one of the most recognizable vehicles. The other woman with Sam was Alma's close friend and physical and emotional antithesis. Laurie Fuller was barely 5 feet tall, overweight, and most undecidedly unfeminine. As a young actress, she often played a boy. As she matured and became known for her dancing rather than her acting, she was described as, quote, built like a column, round and firm and compact. And even at the height of her frame, she usually dressed as if she'd been caught in a thrift store explosion. Now, as she approached the age of 65, Laurie was, in the words of one interviewer, a fat, vivacious, charming lady. She looks like a gypsy with kindly blue eyes and energetic, nervous hands. Laurie's life had overflowed with exclamation points. She was wildly ambitious, but rarely finished any project before dashing off to another. She was bubbly, naive, and overwhelmingly charming, so much so that she made many people nervous. But her ditzy demeanor belied a scientific bent that led her to internationally recognized innovations in stage lighting, costuming, and choreography. She was one of the first women to produce a motion picture, and her dancing was the inspiration for sculpture, paintings, and posters by masters that included Auguste Rodin and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Through a set of unlikely circumstances, Laurie had become an overnight sensation at the fabled Folies Bergère in Paris. Draped in hundreds of yards of gauzy material and using her own lighting system, Laurie performed night after night to sold-out houses and rave reviews. Through the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, She was not only the most famous American woman in Europe, she was also one of the richest. But money and Louie never stayed in the same room too long unless it was in somebody else's pockets. She thus became adept at befriending those with deep pockets. As her career faded, she often coaxed funds from folks she had befriended, such as Queen Marie, Sam Hill, and Alma Spreckels. Now, the stories of these four very different characters and how they came to spawn what's become one of the world's most interesting museums forms a good part of the book. But there's a fifth major character, and that's the museum itself. The second excerpt describes the museum's actual opening 80 years ago in 1940. On a warm, clear day in the summer of 1940, a fellow from New York City stopped by the Maryhill Museum of Fine Arts. He paid 25 cents to go inside and sign the guest book. His name was B.J. Eldridge. He worked for the Frosted Foods Company. He was traveling with his wife from Spokane to Portland, and he was reckoned to be the 30,000th visitor to Maryhill since it had opened 3 months before. Exactly what Mr. Eldridge thought of the museum is lost to history. But if he agreed with the general consensus of the 29,999 visitors before him, he was probably happy with what his quarter bought him. The museum had opened May 13th on what would have been Sam Hill's 83rd birthday. I should interject here that Sam, Louie, and the Queen did not live to see the museum open. The opening ceremonies were attended by 242 invited guests, which was about half the number of the cattle grazing in the fields around the museum. Alma Spreckels unveiled a bronze plaque that commemorated Maryhill's 1926 dedication and bore a quote from the eloquent address Queen Marie had delivered at the time. The opening day crowd was treated to a diverse assortment of art and oddities, which ranged from 17th century paintings to a small watch containing a lock of Queen Victoria's hair. In the basement was a room full of World War I memorabilia. On the other side of the basement was what the Portland Oregonian described as the most comprehensive exhibit of Northwest Indian art ever assembled. The main floor featured gifts from European royalty. That included furniture from Queen Marie and antiquities donated by Marie's daughter Elizabeth, who had briefly been Queen of Greece. There was a room dedicated to religious icons and an impressive collection of works by the famed French sculptor Rodin, who had been a good friend of Louie's. On the third floor, the library featured documents signed by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Abraham Lincoln. There were paintings by American Impressionists and the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. And there was even a chunk of wood, purportedly from the pilgrim ship, the Mayflower. The press was generally impressed, although Time magazine snarkily referred to the museum as being as out of place as a top hat in the jungle and labeled it the world's most isolated art museum. The Oregonian, which only a few years before had predicted certain doom for the museum, cheerfully reversed its forecast. The days of mystery and seclusion are ended, and the castle has come to fulfill the dream of its builder. The rooms are bright, the floors polished, the walls spotless. Sun streams through the tall windows, and all is warmth and welcome. Unfortunately, it was only warmth and welcome for about a year or two. Now keep in mind that the museum was going through all its building and all its opening throes during the Great Depression. So it opens in 1940, and what happens a year later? World War II. So Maryhill closes again. It reopens in 1945. I'd like to skip from there to August 1957 and read a bit about the origin of one of the museum's signature collections. Arthur W. Dake was no longer ranked the third best chess player on earth. In fact, the 47-year-old Grand Master, who had won 3 gold medals at the World Chess Olympiads in the 1930s and had once defeated the legendary Russian world champion, Alexander Alekhine, no longer even competed. He had long ago given up his chess career for a considerably less glamorous but decidedly more secure job with the Oregon Department of Motor Vehicles. But he was still a pretty good player. So when Maryhill Museum Director Clifford Dolph and 25 other people challenged Dake to simultaneous matches on a balmy Sunday afternoon after he'd given a lecture at Maryhill on the game. He readily accepted. Dake got a bit careless in one of the matches and was battled to a draw by a Danish engineering student, but he handily won the other 25. The real winner, however, was Maryhill. Quote, 800 people attended the museum that day, the chess-loving museum director Dolph later told Maryhill's trustees. That figure topped any previous single day. Seeking loans for the exhibit brought Maryhill to the attention of many American and foreign museums and private individuals throughout the globe. The exhibit to which Cliff Dolph referred was a collection of 60 sets of rare, novel, and antique chess sets gathered together for the first such show ever on the West Coast. The exhibit proved so popular, Dolph extended its 1957 run twice, and the publicity was so favorable, Maryhill began receiving gifts of chess sets from all over the world. The museum's permanent chess set collection, which would eventually grow to more than 350 sets, and is considered one of the top 2 or 3 such collections in the world, exemplified 3 important aspects of Maryhill's ability to survive. The first was that to stretch its near non-existent acquisitions budget, it had to be innovative. The second was that to cope with its isolated location, it had to cater to popular tastes without degenerating into the kind of a tourist trap that parks a covered wagon on the lawn and sells grape slushies at the ticket booth. And the third was that for much of its early life, Maryhill was Clifford Dolph's museum. I should talk a bit here about Clifford Dolph. He came to Maryhill in 1938 as sort of a handyman. He got what was supposed to be a temporary job, basically because his aunt was a trustee at the time, and her family had been great friends with Sam Hill. 36 years later, he retired after serving for more than 3 decades as the museum's director. He got that job basically because he was willing to work cheap and to live with his family in the apartment in the basement of the museum. And for those of you who've been to the museum, where the staff offices are in the basement used to be Cliff Dolph's apartment. Cliff loved chess, and he hated Picasso and almost all other modern or abstract art. He was exceedingly clever with his hands, and he built many of the cabinets that are still there at Maryhill. He was also stubbornly set in his ways. He was extremely hardworking, notoriously thrifty, and a clever and sometimes devious politician when it came to dealing with the trustees of the museum. He was not above cutting an ethical corner or two sometimes. But above all, he passionately loved Maryhill, and that fact was what guided him above all other motivations. I think that's why he's a terrific example of why there's a Maryhill today. The people who followed in the footsteps of Sam and Loie and Alma and Queen Marie, and I think too often get forgotten when you think about the history of Maryhill. Over its 80 years in operation, the museum has seen controversy and comedy, creativity and crises. Its cast of characters has ranged from pugnacious peacocks on the lawn to a ghostly presence in the hallway. It's paid its bills by selling peaches, cattle, hay, and hunting licenses. It's raised revenue from car commercials and skateboard races. It's survived political squabbles and personnel scandals and endured leaking roofs and searing droughts. It's benefited from the remarkable financial generosity of a handful of institutions and individuals, and from the tenacity, innovation, and adaptability of its leaders. And I'm talking about people like Cliff Dolph, Zola Brooks, who was the longtime attorney and trustee, Linda Brady Tesner, who was a director, and Colleen Chaffrell. And from time to time, the museum's even been lucky. I mean, who would have ever guessed that there was good money to be made from that blankety-blank wind that seems to blow down the gorge every time I try to have lunch on the cafe patio? All in all, it's a remarkable place. And I have to say, this is all in the book. And as I mentioned, it's a pretty good book. So I don't want to delay you any further from rushing out to buy a copy, or 2, or 3. And don't forget, Christmas is only 155 days away. I counted up this morning. I'll close with a few words from Queen Marie during her dedication of Maryhill on that crisp November morning almost a century ago. There is much more than concrete built into this place, she said. There is a dream built into this place, a dream for today and especially for tomorrow. thanks so much for enduring this, and I'll be happy to take any questions about Maryhill's history, the book writing process, or any other topics except politics, religion, or the wisdom of investing in newspaper stocks. Thank you.
I'm ready to take any questions in the chat if you'd like to, or so I do want everyone to know that we have been recording this so we can play it later on our website. So if there are any questions, go ahead and put them in chat or ask away. You can see on the slide that I have up right now that you can either call Maryhill extension 33 and Jackie will take your order for the book. You can also go online and go to our museum store at Maryhill, and we'll be able to get that book to you. I do have a question from Julie, who is asking, tell us more about what happened to Louie.
Laurie was in 1926, when the museum was dedicated, Laurie was in bad health. She was not performing anymore. She had just lost a huge contract for her dancing troupe that was supposed to tour the United States. She was pretty destitute. She went back to Paris. She died on New Year's Day, 1928. To the end, she was lobbying Sam Hill very hard to get the museum open, to open an auxiliary museum in Paris. And to the very end, she had great ideas. When she died, it's interesting, she was on the front page of virtually every European newspaper, and she was barely mentioned in the American newspapers.
Yeah. We have a question from Elaine, and Elaine is asking, what happened at the museum between 1926 and 1940?
That's a good question. Not a whole lot. What happened was when the museum was dedicated, it was not ready. The building, in fact, was something of an embarrassment to Sam Hill. The interior wasn't finished. There was no art. There were bars on the windows. In fact, while they were cleaning up the museum for the dedication, there were 6 to 9 inches of dust on the floor and a whole lot of dead rats that they had to clean up. They did the dedication. Maryhill basically went back to sleep while Sam battled to get a road built between Vancouver and the museum on the Washington side of the river. Sam died in 1931, and not much progress had been made. And almost immediately after he died, there was a dispute over his will. He had left half his money to support of his children, his son and daughter, and the other half to the building the museum. His son and his estranged wife, contested the will, and it took several years of legal battles before it was finally settled. About the mid-1930s, the estate was settled, and a group of dedicated Sam Hill friends began working to finish the museum. And I mean things like putting in floors and finishing wiring and doing plumbing and repairing the roof. And then they got it done, ready to go about 1939, and they got cold feet because they didn't have anything to display, or not very much. Finally, they were ready, and they opened in May of 1940, as I mentioned, and did really well. And they were very encouraged until World War II came along and they had to close again. So I hope that answers most of what was going on during that period.
So would you just explain one more time very clearly who the quartet is? The four people in the quartet.
The quartet are usually referred to as the four founders. Was Louie Hill, who at the time at the end of the 19th century was considered the most famous dancer in the world. Alma Spreckels, who was a wealthy socialite from San Francisco. Queen Maria of Romania, who was Queen of Romania. And Sam Hill, who actually owned the property and had various enterprises during his lifetime and was considered quite wealthy, although he wasn't quite as wealthy as people thought he was. that four of them had a very complex web of relationships of how they all got to know each other.
Yes.
And it would take me an hour to explain it all, but basically Sam met Alma Spreckels through Alma Spreckels' husband, who was a friend of Sam's. Alma met Louie when Alma went to Paris to buy furniture and was looking for art objects. Louie met the Queen of Romania when she performed before the Queen in Romania. Sam and Alma met the Queen through Louie, and that's how they all four kind of found each other. And none of them had very much in common except that they were all hopeless romantics, and the idea of making this museum all appealed to them.
Thank you. So Sally would like to know, how long did it take you to research this book?
Probably about 2.5 to 3 years of research. There were biographies written about all of the four founders that I just mentioned, and but there wasn't much except peripherally on the museum itself. And fortunately for me, there's a wealth of archival material at the museum, letters and bills and correspondence and minutes from meetings. And it was mainly a matter of just sitting down with box after box and going through them. And sometimes it raised more questions than it answered. So then I would go to other sources and did a lot of digging through newspaper archives. And so I would say roughly about 3 years, I guess, of pure research. And the writing didn't take quite as long.
Thank you. Lynn would like to know if you can just speak a little bit about Sam's intended agriculture venture.
That's an interesting question, Lynn. Sam was a Quaker. He'd been born in North Carolina. His father was a physician, and they were pretty devout Quakers, his parents were. When the Civil War started, because they were Quakers and they were anti-slavery, it wasn't a real healthy place to be. So the Hill family relocated to Minneapolis, where they had relatives. When Sam bought all this land around Maryhill, his original idea was he was going to make a press board out of the straw from the hay. Then he got this idea that he was going to build this agrarian Quaker community. And he started advertising all over the country for Quakers to come to this, what was going to be a bucolic Quaker community in this wonderful spot, this garden spot he'd found. And the fly in the ointment turned out to be no Quakers ever showed up. They built a Quaker meeting house. They had one meeting. It never happened again. They eventually tore the building down and used it for building ranch buildings. Then he tried to advertise it as just to get farmers in general to come. That didn't work out either. So he gave up on that and turned it into a cattle ranch and sort of despaired about what to do with all the land. He got the house about halfway built and kind of gave up on that. And then Laurie Fuller came one day and he showed her the house, and she talked him into turning it into an art museum. And Sam was a very mercurial figure. He would get really excited about something, and then he would drop it and run off to Europe for months at a time. And that's what happened at Maryhill with the museum. He was very excited about it. He lost interest in it. He got excited about it again. At the end of his life, he kind of lost interest in it. And fortunately, people that were good friends of his and admirers of him sort of picked up the torch, and that's why Maryhill got built.
Well, Mary Ann would like to know if you could speak a little bit about Sam's relationship with the locals, specifically about building Stonehenge.
That was another one. It's a great example of Sam's personality. Sam decided during World War I that he was going to build a memorial, a cemetery for all of the fallen soldiers in Klickitat County, which is where Maryhill is located. And he announced it to great fanfare. And as the war went on, it turned out there were only about 13 casualties from Klickitat County. And in the meantime, he had changed his mind. Instead of just having a cemetery, he decided he was going to build a replica of Stonehenge out of concrete that would, because he'd gone and seen the original Stonehenge and someone had told him that's where Druids made human sacrifice. And he thought war was the ultimate human sacrifice, so he was going to build a replica of Stonehenge. The replica he built was not the Stonehenge you go to England and see today. He actually built what it looked like when it was complete. And it was all of concrete. He wanted to put it as close to the spot of the summer solstice as he could, so he enlisted a famous astronomer to show him on the property where that was. And it just happened to be where a hotel that Sam had built was. So Sam tore down the hotel, moved it 100, 200 yards away to a different spot, and had Stonehenge started. This was in 1918. Years went by and it never got done, and the locals started bugging him about it because, after all, it was supposed to be a memorial to their war dead. It was finally finished in 1928, and Sam didn't even attend the opening ceremonies. He had lost interest by that time.
Well, Connie, thank you. Connie said after everyone buys and reads this book, she recommends that everyone read a book called Big Alma, all about Alma Spreckels and how she founded the Museum of the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. So thank you for that. Let's see. There was someone who wants to thank you. Kathleen Irwin wants to thank you for your wonderful words about her grandfather, Clifford Dolph.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yes, he loved the museum. He loved the museum. So
Kathleen was one of the people I interviewed during the process of writing the book. And it's funny, I found her by chance. I had gone on to I just Googled Clifford Dolph looking for background information on his early life. And Kathleen had posted a poem about her grandfather. And so I took a chance. I looked her up, I emailed her, and she was so gracious in sharing information and also putting me in touch with her cousin and another relative. And it was really helpful to fill in some gaps on Cliff Dolph.
Well, Joe would like to ask you if you could expand a little bit about the idea that Laurie Fuller was perhaps not considered conventionally pretty by the standards of the day.
She wasn't, and it's interesting. She was very, as I mentioned, she was only about 5 feet tall. She was stocky. She was pretty when she was in her 20s, but she put on a fair amount of weight. So she wasn't a classical beauty by 19th century stage standards. And in fact, in those days, if you were a 19th century dancer, you were sort of judged by how much leg you were willing to show because the audiences were mostly all male. And Laurie decided that she would turn it into a work of art. So she devised these fantastic costumes that were hundreds of yards of silk. And she would use bamboo or aluminum rods so that they were somewhere 10 or 12 feet long, so she could extend her size on the stage. And she was not a particularly gifted dancer from an athletics standpoint, but she was a real genius when it came to using lighting and things like that. And she opened up the theater to women and children because it wasn't a leg show, it wasn't a peep show or something that was for a male audience. So she turned it into she turned in her, whatever her physical deficits were, into a plus. And I should tell you a little story that she liked to tell about herself. She had performed on stage one time in Paris, and a mother brought a little girl back stage to meet the dancer. And so she introduced the little girl to Laurie, and the little girl said, this is a fat little woman. This isn't the Gary that I saw on stage. That's who I wanted to meet. So Laurie used to tell that story about herself, how she would transform herself when she was on stage.
Sally is asking, did Rodin ever make it to Maryhill?
No, he died in 1917. I'm trying to remember, 1917 or 1918. So he didn't. Rodin had he really loved Laurie, and they had a very close relationship. But he also didn't trust her because she had burned him on a business deal at one point. And Louie was the one who convinced Alma to go and buy things from Rodin, and she convinced Rodin to sell things to Alma. And somebody earlier had mentioned the book on Big Alma. And one of the things that Alma bought from Rodin was a bronze cast of the Thinker, which is still at the Palace of Legion of Fine Arts in San Francisco. And it's one of only 18 that were cast during Rodin's lifetime. But Rodin never saw either the Art Museum in San Francisco or Maryhill.
Thank you. So Mary is asking, this is maybe a question for Colleen about Maryhill having maybe the best collection of Balkan art in the US. And she's asking, is that true? Anna, and if Steve's there, and anyone who's ever been to Maryhill, we can probably say that's true. What do you have to say? They're still on mute.
I'm sorry, did she say Balkan art?
Yes, yes, the art of Romania.
I believe so. I mean, Anna could speak to it much better, but one of the things I know that's going on at Maryhill is the collection of folk costumes from Romania. And it's pretty impressive. And I know the last time I was at Maryhill, Anna was busy doing restoration work and putting that together. So I know that's a big part of it. Maryhill also has one of the really fine collection of Greek Orthodox icons, which a lot of it is from Eastern Europe.
Lynn is asking if Sam was a cousin of J.J. Hill.
I was hoping somebody would ask that because the genealogy gets very crazy. James J. Hill, as many of you might know, was the empire builder. He was a Canadian immigrant who went to St. Paul about the time of the Civil War, created this fabulously huge empire of coal and steel and the railroad that goes from the Midwest to Seattle. J.J. Hill was Sam's father-in-law. They were not related at all. Sam married J.J.'s eldest daughter. Sam had worked for J.J. Hill as a lawyer and ended up being on, I'm trying to remember, about 21 different boards and companies that J.J. Hill owned. But Sam always was in the shadow of his famous father-in-law. Even on the day they were wed, James J. Hill gave his daughter and Sam $200,000 in bonds and railroad stock. And that was the headline all over the country in the story about the wedding. So even on his wedding day, Sam was overshadowed by his father-in-law.
Well, I do have some thanks here from several people thanking you for the wonderful presentation. A few people recommending books that you've inspired them to read about Laurie Fuller, The Magician of Light is another good one. And are there any other questions out there? Well, Steve, we'd like to thank you for your 3 years of research that led to this really wonderful book. And we'd like to remind everybody that the book is for sale at Maryhill by calling our number, and 33 is the extension. Just remember that because the book is $33 and we'll mail it to you for $3. So that's easy to remember, right? Or you can email museumstore@Maryhill Museum and leave your information, and Jackie will get back to you for that. So we're really grateful to everybody who showed up and stayed, and those who came early and those who came late. I hope that you enjoyed every bit of this presentation. Steve, we're so fortunate to have this collaboration with you, and we want to thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting up with me during all that research at Maryhill. And thanks to everybody for Zooming in.
We can thank Anna for that. And Anna, thank you for manning the behind the scenes today. And again, thank you everyone for joining us and for supporting Maryhill. We're working really hard to be ready when the moment that we get to open up, we'll be available to you. We'll be wearing masks. You might not recognize us, but we're doing really big efforts on making sure that we're sanitized, safe, and ready for visitors when we open up. So plan on it. And thank you, everyone. Please stay safe.
Thanks very much. And yes, please stay safe.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.